Hello everybody, it's very nice to be with you today. A different meaning of those words now that we're with each other virtually, and that these types of conferences are being held in this way, in this extraordinary time. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to talk with you all today and to share a little bit about my experiences working on transitional justice and democracy in transitions from mass human rights violations for the past 20 years, mostly in Asia, and before that also in Africa, in Rwanda and other countries, and also in the Middle East. Creatures of connection and herds and villages and all across the world, in African deserts and in the icy north and in Asia where I live, people always live together in villages. So this is an extraordinary time when we're separated, and is an extraordinary step to take to separate people. Today I've been asked to talk a little bit about transitional justice, how it relates to democracy and the struggle for democracy. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about whether transitional justice has any assistance to offer us, and a transitional justice framework or approach, whether that can help us in looking at our challenges today with the global pandemic. In referring to the meaning of transitional justice, I always go back to the words of Kofi Annan and the meaning of what we call TJ for the United Nations, which is, in general terms, all of the initiatives that a society does to deal with a legacy of mass human rights violations. I've worked with countless human rights defenders and victims in many countries who have come up with a lot of creative and unusual and very appropriate ways to deal with mass human rights violations. In international forums that I speak at, people are very often not very aware of the kinds of transitional justice initiatives that have taken place in Asia. There have been a number of countries that have held trials for international crimes. There have been truth and reconciliation commissions, reparations programs, and a whole range of very creative ways of dealing with the history of mass violations. In Timor-Leste, where I spent 6 years helping with the transition, living there, we designed a process called community reconciliation procedures to try and deal with the many, mostly young men who had committed crimes, not the most serious, not murder, rape or torture, but other crimes like burning houses, beating people, stealing animals, and then being driven out of their villages. They wanted to come home, and the villagers said, we need a new mechanism, something that can help us to deal with them. We want to be involved. We don't want it in a court, but it has to be a formal mechanism. So we set up the community reconciliation procedures where perpetrators had to address victims. They had to apologize to them. They had to admit what they'd done. And then they came to an agreement of what was called community reconciliation acts, or acts of reconciliation, in order to seal the deal with the community and the victim, and that was made part of a formal court order. In the Rohingya refugee camps, where my organization, Asia Justice and Rights, or AJA, has teams working today, we're working with more than 80 women survivors of very serious violations by the Burmese military. And one of the things that we're doing in that context, in order to find ways of dealing with those mass violations, is that we ask the women to sew in a small square patches of material the story of what happened to them. We then joined all of those squares together into a quilt. The quilt tells the story of the violations committed against the women, and we're taking that quilt to different places of the world to tell the story, to share the story of those women. In the transitional justice framework, we call that truth-telling, truth-seeking, and very important to share the truth, not just to uncover what it is. So that's a creative way of doing that. There are many other creative transitional justice mechanisms that I've been exposed to in this Asia-Pacific region. For example, I was working in Mindanao, the conflict areas, and I met some of the student leaders there who had organized summer camps of a week long for more than 5,000 university students who went to live for a week in other students' houses. The Catholic students went to live in Muslim houses. The Muslim students went to live in Catholic houses. I thought that was an amazing effort to look at what we might see as the fourth element of the transitional justice framework, guarantees of non-repetition, or trying to reform a situation so that the violations don't recur. All of those thousands of young people having a week-long experience with families from a very different ethno-religious background will have a much deeper understanding of the challenges they face and can contribute to avoiding the outbreaks of violence when misunderstandings between different groups arises. So when we're talking about transitional justice, we're talking about all of the things that a society does to address a history of mass violations. And I still, after all this time, I use a very simple framework that's been adopted and used by many others. It only has 4 elements to it. And I use this framework and these elements to analyze and advise and try and figure out what are the best things to do about mass violations. And those elements are seeking the truth, prosecuting those responsible, providing reparations to victims, and undertaking reforms to avoid recurrence of the violations. Firstly, when we talk about truth-seeking, there are many mechanisms and ways we can do that, and I like to think of them in terms of official and non-official ways. Official ways of seeking the truth include Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and there have been more than 40 such commissions around the world until now. Those commissions look very deeply into what has happened in a society in relation to the violations. They also look at the root causes, who contributed, who was responsible, who were the victims, and what happened to them. That's a very important process. Unofficial mechanisms include what many NGOs do, taking the statements of victims, compiling them, bringing them together to show the patterns of violations and sharing them with the world. A very important part of the truth-seeking element of transitional justice is to share the truth. It's really not going to be very powerful if we undertake a lot of work to find out what happened, but don't share that with the rest of the world. The second element relates to prosecuting those most responsible. This is very difficult in many transitions because those who've been most responsible for mass violations are very often still incredibly powerful following a transition. Also, in many cases, the judiciary has been corrupted and weakened. The police may be used to being aligned with those powerful leaders who are responsible. So bringing them to trial is a very, very challenging issue for many contexts. There are different ways and different places which perpetrators of mass crimes are brought to trial. They can be in international courts like the International Criminal Court, or it can be in national courts who have passed, where the country has passed laws that criminalize international crimes such as crimes against humanity, genocide, or war crimes. And some countries like Timor-Leste, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia have established courts which we call hybrid or mixed, in that the panels of judges are drawn both from the nation and also from international sources such as the United Nations. So those mixed courts, they can draw on the experience of those international judges. It adds a level of objectivity, a bit less political, but they also have the national judges to maintain a certain level of national ownership. The third element of the transitional justice framework we know as reparations, but that word is often confusing, especially to people for whom English is not the first language. I like to remember it by the first part of reparations, which is very close to repair. And what we're talking about in the transitional justice meaning of reparations is to repair the lives of victims. Of course, we can never really repair those lives. Once they've been destroyed, they're very hard to put back together, but it is our duty to try. Governments owe an official duty to try to repair the lives of victims of mass violations. And we might wonder why that is. If we think about that for a moment and ask ourselves, what is the primary duty of a government? We find that the primary duty is to protect the citizens. When there have been very serious violations, the citizens have suffered and have not been protected by the government. They failed in that first and primary duty, and they have a connected duty to try to repair the damage of that failure. Those reparations programs can take many different forms. They can be compensation for individuals. They can be given to groups or to communities. They might be symbolic, such as a day of remembrance. So the first three elements of the transitional justice framework relate to the past: seeking the truth, prosecuting those responsible, repairing the lives of victims. The fourth part involves reform of institutions and society so that there are guarantees of non-repetition. Those are the terminologies used by the UN, guarantees of non-repetition, which is accurate but a little hard for some people to understand. For me, I look at the reforms that are needed when we've undertaken a deep truth-seeking exercise and we know what happened, why it happened, what were the contributing factors. Then we can see what institutions need to be reformed. Very often, a major problem is impunity and a failure of accountability of the security forces. There may be a very low level of accountability in the police or the military, secret police, so that they have enjoyed impunity. Their powers often are then manipulated by the leaders, and nothing happens to somebody who has killed, disappeared, raped, tortured others. That impunity leads those violations to become much more frequent until they become mass violations. The reforms may be to the security forces. They may also be needed for the judiciary, for the media, for the parliament, constitutional reform, legal reform. But it also may be that it's not institutions that need to be reformed, but also elements of the society. In many countries, in Nepal, for example, when we talk to victims and ask them what was the really most fundamental root cause of the conflict here, they said a deep discrimination. And we find that in many places. A discrimination against minorities, a discrimination against ethnic or religious groups leads to a lack of fairness in how they're treated. That leads to frustration and anger, eventually to violence, to payback, often involving the security forces, and then the ensuing conflict creates opportunity for mass killing, rape, torture. So at the root of all of that often is an intense form of discrimination. And in order to address that, to avoid a recurrence of the violations, we need to increase tolerance in the society, to demonstrate and have people understand the value of having a multicultural society. So today we're reflecting on the meaning of transitional justice and how it relates to democracy. And transitional justice, the process of looking at mass violations, reveals that democracy has an integral part to play in mass violations. on one hand, many of the dictators, the authoritarian officials and leaders, the generals, are fearful of democracy. They target their opponents, they lock them up, they detain them, they torture them and disappear them, very often because those opponents are simply seeking democracy. And why is democracy a threat to them? Very often the dictators and the authoritarian leaders are involved in a grand process of mass theft. They are stealing the resources of the country, giving them to their friends and their families, their cronies, and this goes on for years and years. And democracy activists are seeking a system of transparency and accountability, of people being held to account, which would expose what they're doing, and so they target them. Democracy is a major threat to them. On the other hand, when we do have a transitional justice process and we look deeply at the root causes and the contributing factors to mass violations, and then we look at what should be done in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that would be the recommendations chapter of their final report. It very often relates to the restoration of democracy and the different elements of a democracy that will guard against mass violations taking place. So it's about fair elections, it's about an accountable parliament, it's about an independent judiciary, it's about an accountable government, and the rule of law that applies to all people equally, no matter if they're the president or a poor farmer. And while we are focusing today on transitional justice and democracy and remembering the events 40 years ago in South Korea, in Gwangju, it's a good time for us to focus on the cost that is paid by victims, human rights defenders struggling for democracy. On those days, 40 years ago in Gwangju, the government had taken steps to declare martial law and to ban gatherings. Universities were closed. Like their brothers and sisters across the world, the students are very often in the front line of demanding freedom and democracy, and that was the same in Gwangju. The students marched, demonstrating against these oppressive steps, and they were met with the force of the security forces, as they often are. And we can see examples of that from the images of Tiananmen Square, from the Jakarta students demonstrating at the end of the Suharto regime in 1998, and many other places in the world. It's often the students who lead, and very courageously lead, these changes. And in Gwangju, the suffering and the killing of those students created outrage among the ordinary people. The taxi drivers and the bus drivers and ordinary housewives all came out on the streets and said, "We've had enough, we want democracy. We will not stand for this oppressive regime anymore." They had some initial successes. The security forces actually fled and they took refuge in a big hall, and then finally, in a space of about 90 minutes, there was a vicious and brutal response in which at least 600 people were killed. So today, 40 years after that event, we pay tribute to those victims. We pay tribute to all those who were striving for democracy. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about what has filled all our TV screens and discussions and most of our lives in the last months, and that is the global pandemic. When I was asked to talk about transitional justice and democracy today, reflecting back on 40 years ago in Gwangju, looking at the lessons learned around the globe, I was also thinking, does transitional justice have any relevance to these major struggles that we're having today? First of all, I thought, well, this is a health crisis. Obviously, one of the most fundamental human rights that we have is the right to health. And that right to health is recognized in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and a number of other international instruments. And in fact, every country in the world has ratified at least one convention that relates to the right to health. That right to health includes effective treatment, prevention of disease. It also requires governments to provide adequate and effective medical services. So what does this have to do with transitional justice? A transitional justice approach is an approach that looks at mass violations, potentially mass violations of the right to health, for example, and looks at the root causes, not in a small fragment of the picture, but going back years and decades, looking for the root causes, the contributing factors, not being afraid of all of the different connections, to see what actually contributed to and caused the mass violations. And the question came to my mind, in this region of Asia and across the world, transitional justice exposes the actions of many dictators, authoritarian regimes that have stolen billions of dollars from their countries. Those billions of dollars should and could have been spent building hospitals, clinics, training doctors and nurses, buying medical equipment such as ventilators. Instead, they were spent on Rolls Royces and Mercedes Benzes for extravagant gifts for their children and their families, and spirited away to foreign bank accounts. So when we look at it through a transitional justice lens, it raises the question, what's the responsibility of those who have stolen billions of dollars belonging to a country that should have been spent on hospitals and an adequate medical system, when, because of a lack of that quality medical system, hundreds or thousands of people are now dying? That's a transitional justice focus on what's taking place now. And one of the core reasons why we use a transitional justice approach is because it looks at the lessons learned not over 6 months or a year, but throughout decades, to see a much more holistic and full picture. And it uses that picture to inform us about how to prevent mass violations in the future. Today, when we look at the actions of past leaders, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, impunity, grand theft, we should include in the effects that we attribute to those leaders an inadequate medical system and an inability to deal with these major medical crises. A second element of the current crisis, which may have some relevance to transitional justice, relates to the emergency powers that have been passed in so many countries around the world very quickly. In many, many countries, within a period of a few weeks, security forces, police and others have been given unprecedented powers, to all justified on the basis of the medical emergency. Now, a transitional justice approach that looks at the precursors and contributing factors to authoritarian regimes, to militarization, to mass human rights violations in many different contexts, recognizes what has taken place in relation to emergency powers in many, many different countries. And that is that when emergency powers are passed, they are very often used to target critics of the government, to target journalists and human rights defenders, that they're abused, and that can lead to more authoritarian regimes and even militarization. If we look across the region right now and see what is happening and what's happening in the early days after passing those emergency powers, even across the globe in other regions, we can see an alarming picture. In the Philippines and in Indonesia and in Myanmar and other countries, many other countries, journalists have been detained under the emergency powers and also using the Electronic Offences Acts to arrest and detain them for undertaking actions which are designed to shine a light onto the actions of the government. They're reporting on the way the government has responded to the crisis, on corruption relating to the expenditure, holding government to account, and the emergency powers are being used to target the critics of the government. Once again, we're faced with quite a dilemma, because certain emergency powers are appropriate in times like these when there is a global pandemic, and yet who will monitor and hold those security forces and those government officials to account if they are using those powers to arrest and detain anyone who is monitoring them? A transitional justice approach gives us the vantage point of looking at scores of countries in which this has happened before. We know where it leads. It leads to more authoritarian regimes and even military takeovers. So we need to be very vigilant about what's taking place now. So thanks to you all for your attention today, and it's been great to be able to talk to you. It's a bit strange because I can't hear from you while I'm speaking, and I usually like to take lots of questions and comments, but I hope to meet you again in person when things are back to normal and we're once again doing what human beings do, which is to gather together, to exchange information and learn together. Thanks very much.